welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really big figure, someone whose ideas, well, they still cast this huge shadow over how we think about politics and economics. Karl Marx.
Absolutely. Born 1818, died 1883, German philosopher, economist, journalist, and of course, revolutionary socialist.
Yeah, and our goal here is to give you a solid understanding, kind of a shortcut, into his complex life, his ideas, and the massive, often controversial legacy of Marxism.
It really did shape so much of the 20th century, and honestly, it's still right at the heart of debates about globalization, inequality, you name it.
It's essential, isn't it? If you want to understand modern sociology or labor theory or even just the history of revolutionary movements, you've got to grapple with Marx.
You really do. We're going beyond the basic summaries. We want to look at the detailed intellectual structure he built.
And that structure, I guess the main pillars are his most famous works.
Definitely. First, there's that incredibly influential pamphlet from 1848, the Communist Manifesto. He wrote that with Friedrich Engels, his lifelong collaborator.
Right, Engels. We'll talk more about him.
Okay.
And the second big one.
That's his huge multi-volume work, Das Kapital. The first volume came out in 1867, but it stretched over decades. It's this massive critique of classical political economy.
Devastating critique, you called it.
Well, it was meant to be. And Das Kapital is where you really see his method, his theory of historical materialism in action. He uses it to dissect, or as he said, anatomize capitalism itself.
So historical materialism, that's key to his approach.
It's fundamental. It's the idea that history progresses based on material conditions and class struggle. And that's why he's still so relevant. He was both this deep scholar and a figure who inspired massive political movement.
Oh, okay, quite a figure. Let's start at the beginning then. Not with the revolution, but with his upbringing. You mentioned it was contradictory.
Yeah, we start in Trier, Prussia. And right away there's this tension in his family life. They were originally non-religious Jewish, descended from rabbis, actually going back generations in Trier.
Okay, but something changed. Prussia.
Exactly. When Prussia took over the Rhineland in 1815, they rolled back the rights Jews had gained. Jewish emancipation was canceled.
Ah, so for his father, Heinrich, who was a lawyer.
It created a huge problem. To keep his job, his career, his comfortable middle-class life, he had to make a choice.
He had to convert.
He converted to the state religion, the Evangelical Church of Prussia, in 1817. Karl himself was baptized later, along with his siblings.
Wow. But wasn't his father quite liberal-minded?
Very much so. That's the irony. Heinrich was a man of the Enlightenment. He admired Kant, Voltaire, believed in reason, classical liberalism, but the conservative state forced him into a religious conversion he didn't fundamentally believe in just to keep practicing law.
So Marx grows up seeing this split liberal ideas at home, but this sort of performative conformity required by the state, by material needs.
You'd have to think that planted a seed, right? This idea of the economic base shaping the ideological superstructure, it's right there in his childhood.
And his schooling, did that play into it?
It did. He went to Trier High School, and the headmaster there, Hugo Wittenbach, was a liberal humanist. He hired staff with similar views.
Which probably didn't sit well with the local government.
Not at all. It got so tense that in 1832, the police actually raided the school, looking for liberal political literature they thought the teachers were distributing. So yeah, the young Marx was right in the middle of this political tension from early on.
Then university, law first. At his father's insistence.
Yes, law at the University of Bonn. And by all accounts, it was a bit of a disaster.
How so?
Well, Marx was more interested in philosophy literature. He joined a radical poets club, got into drinking, even dueling. His grades weren't great.
Sounds like a typical rebellious student phase.
Pretty much. His father wasn't impressed and made him transfer to the University of Berlin, which was seen as more serious, more rigorous.
And Berlin. That's where things clicked intellectually.
That's where he found his path. He dropped law pretty quickly and dove into philosophy, specifically the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Hegel, hugely influential figure. But Marx wasn't just a follower, was he?
No, not at all. He was fascinated by Hegel's dialectical method, the idea that history moves through conflict, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But he strongly rejected Hegel's idealism, the notion that ideas or spirit drive history.
So what did he do with Hegel's ideas?
He joined a group called the Young Hegelians. They were radical thinkers who basically flipped Hegel on his head. They used his dialectical method, but applied it to critique society, politics, religion, everything from a radical left-wing perspective.
Okay, so the intellectual ferment is happening.
Yeah.
What about his personal life during this time?
Well, this is when he got engaged to Jenny von Westphalen. and that was quite controversial.
Why? Class difference.
Yeah, class and background. Jenny was from the petty nobility, educated, and she actually broke off an engagement to an aristocrat to be with Marx. They had a long engagement, finally marrying in 1843.
But there was another connection there, wasn't there? With her father.
Yes, and this is important. Marx was actually very close to Jenny's father, Ludwig von Westphalen. He was a liberal aristocrat himself, interested in thinkers like St. Simon, the early socialist. He introduced Marx to some of these ideas.
Interesting. And Marx dedicated his doctoral thesis to him.
He did. The thesis itself, the difference between the Democritian and Epicurean philosophy of nature, was too radical for the conservative University of Berlin.
So he couldn't get his PhD there?
Nope. He had to submit it to the more liberal University of Jena, and they awarded him the doctorate in 1841. But this kind of radicalism pretty much closed the door on an academic career in Prussia.
Which pushed him towards journalism.
Exactly. He started writing for a radical newspaper in Cologne, the Rheinische Zeitung, in 1842. He began expressing more economic and socialist views there.
How long did that last?
Only about a year. He wrote articles criticizing the Prussian government, but the real trigger was an article criticizing the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I. That was the final straw. The paper was shut down by the censors in early 1843.
And that's it. From radical thinker to political exile.
That's the moment. He's forced out of Prussia, #2, Paris, Engels, and the foundational ideas, 1843 to 1845.
So Prussia kicks him out. Where does he go? Paris, right. The heart of European radicalism in 1843.
Paris was the place to be if you were a radical thinker. He moved there to co-edit a new journal, the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, German-French Annals.
Did that journal take off?
Not really. It only managed one issue, but that single issue was incredibly important for Marx's development. It contained 2 crucial essays he wrote.
Which ones?
Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and On the Jewish Question. These really mark his full turn towards communism. He argues that philosophy isn't enough. You need action. And he identifies the proletariat, the industrial working class, as the only group capable of carrying out the necessary revolution.
So this is where he really embraces the working class as the agent of change.
Yes, and Paris is also where that fateful meeting happens, the one that changed everything.
With Friedrich Engels.
Exactly. August 28th, 1844, at the Café de la Régence. It's one of history's crucial encounters. Engels wasn't just a thinker. He was the son of a German textile factory owner with businesses in Manchester, England.
So he had first-hand experience of industrial capitalism.
He did, and he'd just written a book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, in 1844. He showed it to Marx, and it had a massive impact. It gave Marx the concrete, empirical evidence of the workers' suffering and their potential power that he needed to back up his developing theories.
So Engels convinces him the working class is the force for revolution.
It solidified that belief, yes. Engels provided the real-world grounding.
Okay, so if we think about this Paris period, it's like a melting pot for his ideas. What are the main ingredients coming together to form what we now call Marxism?
It's really a synthesis of 3 big streams of thought. First, you've got Hegel's dialectics, which gives him the method, the engine of conflict driving historical change.
Okay, the method. What else?
Second, there's French utopian socialism. Thinkers like St. Simon, Fourier, they provided the vision, the ideal of a future communal, classless society, even if Marx thought their methods were naive.
Right, he criticized them later. And the third?
That's British political economy, Adam Smith, David Ricardo. Their work gave him the tools, the rigorous economic framework that he could then critique and turn against capitalism itself. By late 1844, the sources suggest these 3 elements had basically fused. The core of Marxism was in place.
And this is also where he starts developing key concepts like alienation.
Yes, particularly in his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which weren't published until much later. He talks about alienated labor.
How does he define that?
He argues that under capitalism, the worker is separated or alienated from the product they make, from the actual activity of working, from their fellow workers, and ultimately from their own human nature, their Gattungswesen, or species being.
Species being.
Yeah, the idea that what makes us human is our ability to consciously shape the world through our labor. Capitalism strips that away, causing not just economic hardship, but a kind of spiritual loss.
So this deepens his critique beyond just economics. It's philosophical, almost existential?
It is, and it pushes him towards needing what he called scientific socialism, a socialism based not on moral appeals or utopian dreams, but on a rigorous, materialistic understanding of the world.
Which leads to that famous break with idealism.
The Theses on Feuerbach. written in 1845. It's his definitive statement against purely philosophical critique. And Thesis 11 is the one everyone knows.
Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways.
The point is to change it. That sums it up. The goal shifts from understanding to action to revolution based on that understanding. Hashtag, tag, 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 tag 3. The Communist Manifesto, 1845-1848.
Okay, so he's formulated the core ideas, but then he gets kicked out of France too, right? Where does he land next?
Brussels in Belgium. And this period, from 1845 to 1848, is less about developing brand new theories and more about political organizing, getting the movement going.
Right, because theory is one thing, but change needs organization.
Exactly. Marx and Engels looked at the existing radical groups like the League of the Just, which was this sort of secret society of, well, mostly German artisans.
And they thought it wasn't fit for purpose.
They thought it was too conspiratorial, too based on utopian ideals. They wanted something open, something that could mobilize the entire working class. So they worked to transform it.
Into what?
Into the Communist League, which was formally established in 1847. It was meant to be an open international political party.
And the strategy was different from the utopian socialists.
Fundamentally different. The utopians tried to persuade people, often wealthy patrons, of the moral rightness of their vision. Marx and Engels said, no, you mobilize a class, the proletariat, based on their shared material interests.
Because their economic position inevitably puts them in conflict with the bourgeoisie.
Precisely. It's about appealing to their objective economic reality, not just convincing individuals one by one. That's the scientific part of their socialism. It's based on analyzing the material forces at play.
And this new Communist League needed a platform, a statement of principles.
Which brings us to the Communist Manifesto. They were commissioned by the League to write it.
Published when? Just before the revolutions.
Yeah, incredible timing. Published in London in February 1848, just weeks before revolution started breaking out across Europe. It was meant as the League's program.
And it lays out that historical narrative.
Right, from the famous opening line, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It paints this grand picture of historical development driven by conflict.
Setting up that core conflict for the modern era, bourgeoisie versus proletariat.
Exactly. The owners of the means of production versus those who only have their labor to sell. The manifesto argues the bourgeoisie created the conditions for its own destruction by creating the proletariat.
And it predicts the proletariat's victory.
Yes. It outlines the perceived inevitability of capitalism's collapse and the rise of the working class. And it ends with a list of demands: abolition of private property and land, progressive income tax, centralization of credit, free education, and so on, aimed at creating a socialist society.
It's incredibly powerful, direct prose.
It's designed to be. It's a call to arms.
But even as this is published, Marx's time in Brussels is running out. Why?
Well, the 1848 revolutions start erupting. Around this time, Marx actually received a significant inheritance from his father. The sources say maybe 5,000 or 6,000 francs.
A lot of money back then.
A substantial sum. And the allegation, which the Belgian authorities certainly believed, was that Marx used at least part of it to buy weapons for Belgian workers who were planning revolutionary actions.
Wow. So putting his money where his mouth was, literally funding the revolution.
Whether it's entirely true or not, the Belgian government acted on it. He was arrested and quickly expelled from Belgium.
So where now? Back to France.
Briefly. He went back to Paris, but the revolutionary government there didn't want him either and soon expelled him again. Then he went back to Cologne for a bit, tried to revive the newspaper.
But the counter-revolution was setting in.
It was. By August 1849, the revolutions had largely failed. Marx found himself stateless, exiled once more, and this time he headed for London.
London, where he'd spend the rest of his life.
Yes, the final long exile, and the place where he'd write his masterpiece.
So Marx arrives in London in 1849, and this marks the beginning of, well, a really difficult period for him personally, doesn't it?
Incredibly difficult. Decades of extreme poverty, often living in squalid conditions in Soho with his growing family. Remember, he was stateless, no citizenship anywhere.
And financially, how did they survive?
It was precarious, constantly juggling debts. They relied heavily, almost entirely sometimes, on financial support from Engels back in Manchester.
Engels, the factory owner's son, supporting the great critic of capitalism.
The irony is inescapable, isn't it? The man dissecting the exploitative nature of the system was living off the profits generated by that very system. It's a stark contradiction.
Did he have to hide? Was he under surveillance?
Oh, yes. He was definitely monitored by Prussian spies and others. He often had to use aliases just to rent rooms, like A. Williams, that was one he used in London, just to avoid creditors and authorities.
But amongst friends, he had a nickname.
Yeah, his close circle called him Moore, apparently because of his dark complexion and black curly hair.
So, personally struggling, but intellectually and politically, he wasn't quiet, was he? There was conflict within the Communist League itself.
Right away, yeah. There was a major split. On one side, you had Marx and Engels. On the other, a faction led by August Willich and Karl Schapper.
What was the disagreement about? Strategy.
Fundamentally, yes. Willich and Schapper were pushing for immediate revolutionary action, sort of adventurism, believing the working class could just rise up spontaneously if pushed.
And Marx disagreed.
Strongly. He thought that was incredibly naive and irresponsible, doomed to fail. He argued based on his historical materialism.
Which meant what, in practical terms?
It meant recognizing the stages of development. Marx argued that capitalism wasn't fully mature yet, especially in places like Germany. The first step, he believed, was for the working class to potentially align with the progressive elements of the bourgeoisie to overthrow the remnants of feudalism and aristocracy.
To achieve democratic reforms first.
Exactly. Things like universal male suffrage, a constitutional republic. These were seen as necessary preconditions. Only after capitalism had developed further and its contradictions became clearer could the proletariat successfully take power for itself.
So trying to force a socialist revolution too early would backfire.
That was his fear. It would lead to defeat or, perhaps worse in his view, a premature, unstable regime that couldn't sustain itself or would become repressive. This distinction between a staged, scientific approach and immediate voluntarism was a really key dividing line.
Okay, so he's fighting these internal battles. But how's he earning any money during this time, besides Engels' help?
His main lifeline for about a decade, from 1852 to 1862, was journalism. He became the European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune.
That was a major newspaper, right?
Huge. It had the largest circulation in the United States at the time, something like 50,000 copies, and it was generally progressive, strongly abolitionist.
So it gave him a significant platform.
An incredible platform to write about European politics, wars, economic crises, colonialism, all analyzed through his developing materialist perspective for an American audience.
Why did that arrangement end?
Well, the editor who hired him, Charles Dana, left the paper in late 1861. The new editorial team, during the American Civil War, started leaning towards supporting a quick peace settlement between the North and the South.
Which would have preserved slavery.
Exactly. And Marx was vehemently anti-slavery. He couldn't abide by that editorial line. He disagreed strongly, and his contributions basically dried up by 1863. He had to withdraw.
So the journalism big ends. This period, the 1850s and 60s, is really when he hunkers down in the British Museum, right? This is the deep research phase.
Yes, this is the intellectual engine room. It's often seen as the dividing line moving from the younger, more philosophical Marx, still heavily influenced by Hegel, to the mature, scientific, structural Marx, focused squarely on political economy.
All that time in the library led to, well, Das Kapital, eventually. But there were steps along the way.
Oh, definitely. It was years of intense study. It first resulted in a massive collection of notebooks and essays, hundreds of pages, known as the Grundriss, that wasn't published in his lifetime.
Sort of preparatory work.
Exactly. Then came a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859. But that was really just a prelude, clearing the ground for the main assault.
Which was Das Kapital, Volume 1, finally published in 1867.
Let's get into the core ideas here. What's the absolute central concept?
Without doubt, it's his theory of surplus value. This is the engine of his whole critique of capitalism.
Explain that. How does it work? Okay, so Marx starts from the idea that the value of a commodity comes from the socially necessary labor time needed to produce it. But, he argues, the capitalist who hires a worker doesn't pay the worker for the full value their labor creates.
So they pay them what? Just enough to survive.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They pay the worker the value of their labor power, basically, what it costs to keep the worker alive, fed, clothed, and able to reproduce to create the next generation of workers. This is the wage.
Okay, so the wage covers the worker's subsistence. But the worker produces more value than that during the workday.
Precisely. Let's say a worker needs to work 4 hours to produce enough value to cover their wage, but the capitalist has hired them for an 8-hour day, those extra 4 hours of work.
That's the unpaid labor.
That's surplus labor. And the value created during that surplus labor time is surplus value. This surplus value, according to Marx, is appropriated by the capitalist and is the only source of profit.
So profit isn't made through clever trading or buying low and selling high.
Not fundamentally. For Marx, profit originates in the process of production, through the exploitation of living labor power. It's extracted before the commodity even gets to the market.
It's built into the relationship between the worker and the owner of the means of production.
Exactly. He did say, technically, that within the rules of capitalism, this wasn't necessarily an injustice in a legal sense, but his language
Betrays a certain moral outrage.
Oh, definitely. He talks about capitalists as vampires sucking the living labor of the worker. It's clear how he felt about the inherent exploitation.
Beyond just describing this exploitation, Das Kapital also tries to uncover the system's internal dynamics, its laws of motion. What's the key prediction he makes about capitalism's future?
That would be the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This is probably his most famous and also most contested economic law.
How does that work? Why would the profit rate tend to fall?
Okay, capitalists are always competing, always trying to increase efficiency and cut costs. They do this mainly by investing more in machinery, technology, raw materials, what Marx called constant capital.
And less in human workers.
Relatively speaking, yes. Investment in human labor power, what Marx called variable capital, tends to decrease as a proportion of total investment compared to constant capital.
But wait, you just said profit, surplus value, comes only from living labor, from variable capital.
Exactly. That's the core contradiction. If surplus value, the source of profit, only comes from variable capital V, but capitalists are constantly investing more in constant capital C relative to V, then the overall rate of profit for the economy, which is essentially surplus value divided by total capital C plus V, must have a long-term tendency to decline.
So the drive for efficiency through technology actually undermines the very source of profit itself.
That's the inherent self-destructive logic Marx identified. This falling rate of profit forces capitalists into ever more frantic behavior, seeking new markets, intensifying exploitation, cutting wages.
And it leads to crises.
Yes, he saw capitalism as inherently unstable, prone to recurring cyclical crises. These crises actually serve a function within the system. They destroy excess capital, allow for restructuring, and temporarily restore profitability before the cycle begins again.
It sounds like a system destined to collapse under its own weight. It's quite amazing, then, that he didn't manage to finish the entire work himself.
No, he didn't. His health was really deteriorating in his later years. Chronic illnesses we can maybe touch on later. He just didn't have the sustained energy needed to pull together the massive amount of material for the later volumes.
So volumes 2 and 3.
They were published after his death by Engels. Engels painstakingly went through Marx's incredibly dense, often nearly illegible notes and manuscripts, organizing and editing them into publishable form. Volume 2 came out in 1885, Volume 3 in 1894, a monumental task of editorial dedication. #6, political interventions and final thoughts.
Even while he was buried in the British Museum stacks working on Capital, Marx didn't completely withdraw from politics, did he? He was involved in the First International.
Very much so. He was a key figure in founding the International Working Men's Association in 1864. He basically dominated its general council, writing its key documents.
And wasn't there a big ideological fight within the International? With the anarchists?
Yes, a major struggle against the anarchist faction led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. They had fundamentally different ideas about the state, revolution, and organization.
Who won that fight?
Politically, Marx did. He managed to get Bakunin and his followers expelled in 1872. However, Marx also supported moving the General Council headquarters to New York City around the same time.
Which effectively sidelined it.
Many argue it did. Moving it away from the center of European working-class movements led to its decline and eventual dissolution a few years later. So a political victory, but maybe a Pyrrhic one for the International itself.
And what about actual revolutions? Did he comment on contemporary events? The Paris Commune?
Oh, absolutely. The Paris Commune of 1871, where workers briefly took control of Paris before being brutally crushed, was hugely significant for him.
How does he see it?
He wrote a powerful defense of it in a pamphlet called The Civil War in France. He hailed the Commune as the first historical example, however short-lived, of the dictatorship of the proletariat workers actually running their own state, taking power into their own hands. It was a practical model, a glimpse of the future.
Looking further ahead, did he ever articulate what the final stage of communism would look like after the revolution, after the dictatorship of the proletariat?
He did, most famously in his Critique of the Gotha program, written in 1875. This was actually an internal critique of a draft program for a unified German socialist party, which he felt made too many compromises with the state.
And what was the vision he laid out?
He described 2 stages of communist society. The first, lower stage, would still bear the birthmarks of capitalism. But the higher phase, achievable only after scarcity was overcome and the state had withered away, would operate on the principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That became the ultimate aspirational goal.
It's interesting. After spending decades focused on industrial capitalism in Western Europe, did his focus shift at all in his later years?
It did, quite significantly. He became very interested in anthropology and studies of non-Western societies, particularly communal forms of land ownership.
Like in Russia.
Exactly. He corresponded with Russian radicals like Vera Zasulich. In a famous letter draft from 1881, he seriously considered whether Russia might be able to bypass the full development of capitalism.
How? Based on what?
Based on the existing Russian peasant commune, the Mir, which had traditions of collective land ownership. He wondered if Russia could potentially build communism directly on that communal foundation, skipping the painful capitalist stage that Western Europe had endured.
That seems like a major shift from his earlier insistence on historical stages.
It was a potential modification, yeah. But he added a crucial condition. This bypass was only possible, he warned, if the Mir could be saved from the deleterious influences, meaning encroaching private property and capitalism that were already undermining it, and would likely need a successful proletarian revolution in the West to support it.
So it wasn't a complete rejection of his model, but an opening to other possibilities based on specific local conditions.
Yes, it shows a late-life flexibility in his thinking, acknowledging that the path to communism might not be identical everywhere.
Okay, let's try to pull together some of the core theoretical threads we've touched on. His overall view of society, it comes back to dialectical materialism, right?
That's the bedrock. History isn't driven by great ideas or great men, but by material conditions and the conflicts they create, specifically class conflict.
The struggle between
the class that owns the means of production, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie under capitalism, and the class that works those means the proletariat. Society evolves through this ongoing tension, this dialectic.
And this ties into his view of human nature, that concept of Gattungswesen.
Yes, the species being. For Marx, what's essential about being human is our ability to consciously, creatively transform the material world through our labor. It's how we realize ourselves.
So, under capitalism, when labor is alienated,
it's more than just being underpaid. It's a deep spiritual loss, as he put it. You're alienated from the product you make. The activity of working becomes meaningless toil. You're set against your fellow workers in competition. And ultimately, you're alienated from your own human potential, your species being.
That's why capitalism isn't just unjust. It's fundamentally dehumanizing in his view.
Exactly. It prevents us from fulfilling our true nature.
Okay, now how does he explain the relationship between the economy and other parts of society, law, politics, culture? That's the base and superstructure model.
Correct. This is one of his most famous contributions to sociology. The base, or substructure, is the economic foundation of society. That includes
the means of production, factories, land, tools, technology.
Right. And the relations of production, who owns the means, how labor is organized, the property laws, the wage system. This economic base, Marx argues, fundamentally determines the superstructure.
And the superstructure is everything else.
Pretty much. Politics, law, the state, culture, ideology, religion, family structures. All these non-economic institutions and forms of consciousness ultimately arise from and reflect the underlying economic base. They serve to and serfdom generates a superstructure with a monarchy, a rigid aristocracy, laws tied to land tenure, and a religious ideology that emphasizes hierarchy and divine right.
Whereas a capitalist base, with factories and wage labor,
requires different superstructure, perhaps a parliamentary democracy, at least for the bourgeoisie, laws protecting private property and enforcing contracts, an ideology of individualism and free markets, and so on. The superstructure adapts to maintain the base.
And social change revolution happens
when there's a fundamental contradiction between the base and superstructure. For instance, when the means of production, technology, develop to a point where the existing relations of production, ownership structures, become a fetter, an obstacle to further progress, that's when social conflict intensifies, leading to revolutionary transformation.
This deterministic view also shapes his analysis of religion. It's not just opium of the people, is it?
No, that famous phrase needs context. He definitely saw religion as a human creation, not divinely inspired. But his analysis was more sociological than just dismissive.
He saw it as expressing something real.
Yes, let's look at the full quote again. It's worth it. Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering.
So it's both a symptom and a cry of pain.
Exactly. He continues. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So it provides comfort, solace, meaning in a brutal, alienating world.
And then comes the opium part.
It is the opium of the people. Meaning, like opium, it dulls the pain, makes the suffering bearable, but it doesn't cure the underlying disease, the oppressive material conditions. And crucially, by offering this illusory comfort, it can also discourage people from seeking real material solutions, thus helping to maintain the status quo and legitimize inequality. ######8. Global and personal ambivalences.
It strikes me that Marx had a very complex, almost contradictory view of capitalism itself. He condemned it fiercely, but also seemed to admire it.
That's a great way to put it. Ambivalent is the word. He provided the most devastating critique of its exploitation and alienation. Yet at the same time, he saw the bourgeoisie as the most revolutionary class in history up to that point.
Revolutionary how?
In terms of progress, capitalism, for all its brutality, swept away feudalism, unleashed incredible productive forces, developed technology, created cities, connected the world through markets. He saw it as a historically necessary and progressive stage compared to what came before.
Even while creating the very conditions for its own overthrow.
Precisely. It created its own grave death. The proletariat. It was a system full of dynamic contradictions. Necessary evil, perhaps.
His views on international affairs seem similarly complex. Russia, for instance.
He had a deep distrust, almost hatred, of Tsarist Russia. He saw the Russian Empire as the great bastion of reaction in Europe, the main threat to any potential revolution. This made him fiercely oppose movements like Pan-Slavism, which he viewed as just a cover for Russian expansionism.
But other national movements he supported. Ireland.
Very strongly. He came to believe that Irish independence was crucial, not just for the Irish, but for the English working class too. He argued that English workers could never achieve their own emancipation as long as England oppressed Ireland, because that oppression fueled reaction back home and divided the working class.
Okay, now, probably the most challenging example of this ambivalence. His views on colonialism, particularly British rule in India.
Yes, this is very difficult territory. On the one hand, he was absolutely scathing about the brutality and destruction caused by British colonialism. He wrote about the infinitely more intensive kind of misery inflicted by the British compared to previous rulers, how they broke down the entire framework of Indian society.
He didn't shy away from the horrors.
Not at all. But then, applying his logic of historical materialism, he reached a conclusion that sounds shocking today.
Which was?
He concluded that despite the brutality, British intervention was ultimately progressive. Why? Because it was shattering what he saw as stagnant, unchanging, semi-barbarian, semi-civilized village communities, which he believed were the basis of Oriental despotism.
So breaking down the old order, however violently, was a necessary step towards potential future development.
That was his harsh, unsentimental logic. The destruction of the old feudal structures, even by a brutal colonial power, was creating the preconditions, however awful, for India to eventually enter the modern capitalist stage, and thus eventually the path towards socialism.
It's a stark example of his historical determinism overriding immediate human cost. Did he comment on the attitudes of colonizers?
Oh, yes. He wasn't blind to colonial arrogance. He noted things like the casual use of torture by French authorities in Algeria against Arabs. His analysis was global and often chillingly objective.
We should also touch on his personal life again, specifically his health. It sounds like he suffered terribly for much of his adult life.
He really did. It wasn't just poverty. He had chronic, debilitating health problems, liver issues, insomnia, gallbladder problems, and most famously, these incredibly painful boils carbuncles, likely a severe skin condition called hidradenitis suppurativa.
That sounds agonizing. It must have affected his work, his temperament.
Almost certainly. He often complained about the wretchedness of existence in his letters. Biographers often speculate that this constant physical pain contributed to his well-known personality traits, his irritability, his sharp sarcasm, his sometimes harsh treatment even of allies like Engels.
There's even a theory linking the skin condition directly to his theory of alienation.
Yeah, the dermatologist Sam Schuster proposed that the sheer misery and social isolation caused by such a visible, painful condition might have actually intensified Marx's own feelings of alienation, feeding back into his theoretical critique of a society that produced such suffering. It's speculative, but intriguing. #9, the modern echo.
Okay, let's turn to the legacy. Politically, it's undeniable. Marx's ideas didn't stay in books. They became the official ideology of huge states in the 20th century.
Absolutely colossal impact. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, regimes governing vast swaths of humanity claim to be built on Marxist principles.
And leaders across the spectrum cited him as an influence.
Yes, from revolutionaries like Lenin, Mao, Castro, Ho Chi Minh, to figures like Nelson Mandela in his earlier years, and even contemporary leaders like China's Xi Jinping still invoke Marx. The reach is just immense.
But that political legacy is incredibly fraught, isn't it? How do we connect Marx the theorist to the actions of states claiming his name?
That's the million-dollar question, and the debate rages constantly. On one side, you have people who argue you must separate Marx's original thought from the ways it was distorted, abused, or selectively applied by authoritarian regimes, like Stalin's Soviet Union or Maoist China.
Like Jean-Claude Juncker, the former EU Commission president, who said Marx stands for things which he is not responsible for.
Exactly. That view emphasizes the gap between the emancipatory potential in Marx's critique and the often brutal reality of actually existing socialism. They'd say Stalinism was a perversion, not a fulfillment of Marx.
But the other side argues, what? That his ideas inherently lead there.
They argue that elements within Marx's own theories, the emphasis on revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the critique of bourgeois rights, the historical determinism created a blueprint or justification, even if unintentional, for the suppression of dissent and the creation of totalitarian states that followed. They hold him accountable, at least partially, for the consequences.
It's a debate that probably can't ever be fully resolved. But what about his academic legacy? Does he still hold weight in social science?
Oh, unquestionably. Regardless of the political movements, his intellectual impact is profound and lasting. He's widely seen, alongside figures like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, as one of the key founders of modern sociology.
Isaiah Berlin called him the true founder.
He did. And Marx's concepts, class analysis, ideology critique, historical materialism, the analysis of capital, alienation, are still fundamental tools used across the social sciences and humanities. His critique of capitalism continues to resonate powerfully today, especially in discussions about globalization, economic crises, inequality.
We see things like eco-Marxism, feminist critiques engaging with Marx.
Exactly. His work remains a vital, if contested, resource for understanding and critiquing the contemporary world.
And finally, his resting place, Highgate Cemetery in London.
Yes. Originally buried in a simple grave, but in 1954 a large monument with a bust of Marx was erected by the Communist Party of Great Britain.
And it bears those two famous lines, summing up the duality we've discussed.
It does. From the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of all lands unite," and from the Theses on Feuerbach.
The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
Which brings us right back to that central tension, doesn't it?
It really does. We spent this time looking at the thinker who poured his life into scientifically proving, as he saw it, that capitalism's collapse was inevitable. Baked into its own laws of motion in Das Kapital, it was something to be analyzed, almost predicted.
A process unfolding according to economic laws.
And yet, the words on his grave, the quote he's perhaps most famous for, insist that interpretation isn't enough. The whole point is change, action, revolution.
It's theory demanding practice, scientific certainty meeting revolutionary will.
So the final thought for you, listening to this deep dive, might be about that very duality. How much of Marx's enduring disruptive influence comes from the power of his analysis, that incredibly detailed anatomy of capital he gave us?
The description of the machine, as it were.
And how much comes from the sheer force of that call to action, the urgency to not just understand the world, but to fundamentally transform it? What does it take for an idea born in exile and poverty to leap off the page and actually reshape history?
That question, posed by Marx's life and work, is still being answered, debated, and fought over across the globe today.
A truly deep dive. Thank you for navigating us through the immense, complex world of Karl Marx.
It was my pleasure, a necessary journey.